the second International Congress on Consciousness. I'm here in Miami and I have a great pleasure to be now with Katherine Peil Kauffman. She gave a wonderful presentation on emotional sentience and what's the role of that in evolution. And I think we have very interesting things to hear from her. Katherine has a background in clinical psychology and she founded an organization called Emotional Feedback System to support research in this area. So Katherine, please tell us how you jumped from clinical psychology to study this in this technical way you do that's very passionate.
Oh, thank you for asking. My story is a very wonderful tangle of events that none of them happened in the right order. I was originally drawn to clinical psychology because I had had a career and children and a wonderful family with all kinds of emotional dysfunction. So I had this beautiful buffet of dysfunction, and I noticed that the center of all of it was how we felt and how it drove our behaviors and how our feelings had to do with our sense of who we were, how we identify ourselves, and how we bound our identity in time and space and in terms of our connectivity empathically to one another. And so I was, by the time I got a chance to go to school, I was already in my late 20s, and I almost immediately, like my very first psychology class, just zoomed right in on emotion. And I wanted to understand what it was because I had learned from my own experiences that emotion was telling me something. I remember there was a moment when I was a very scrappy young person in government, and I had really great opportunities, and I just went to the top as fast as I could. But there were times when I would come right up against people that were they didn't like how I was succeeding as much as I was. So there was a moment when I had to come up against a panel of people that were really not telling the truth about me, but they had like attorneys, and here I'm sitting on this bench all alone, and I had the truth in my hands, but the determination was not in my favor. And I remember going home and being just shaking with emotion and realizing, wow, this is telling me something. There's this huge gap between my reality and the reality of the situation that I was in, and it didn't really matter if I had the facts on my side. So I remember thinking, oh, this is really important. So by the time I started to study it, I realized almost immediately that there was a huge connection with motivation. And I was fortunate enough to work with the emotion guru at the time, the motivation guru, and he'd never thought much about emotion, and we got together and it was just like fireworks.
So you brought an element there that was somehow
Yes, and he was wonderful. My very first mentor, Dr. Robert Bowles, who unfortunately died 2 short years later. But I wanted really to pursue the idea that there was information and a profound use in emotion, and even the term emotional intelligence had just been coined, but it wasn't popularized or anything. And so I was very excited when I found that, because I thought I was all alone with this sort of idea. But I was ultimately really disappointed that with the options that I had in terms of studying psychology, because everyone was trying to figure out what it was by looking in the brain, and there wasn't really any agreement on a definition, and there still isn't. So I ended up, there was a series of what were rather horrific life events that were very painful at the time, and yet they were wonderfully synchronistic as to put me on the tracks that I needed to be on in those moments to continue doing this work, one of which was the death of my mentor and the collapse of my marriage and family responsibility. So I, instead of going on to do traditional academic work, I started my own nonprofit so I could do the work on my own, and I became an interdisciplinary emotion researcher, which is what I still call myself now 25 years later.
And that is a very complex area in itself, right? Because what could be more boggling in our minds than emotions per se? Because, as you said, you see one fact, but then you may feel different about it, and people react differently. You made a very interesting connection between emotions and even cellular organisms and how they react, and how emotions somehow took part in evolution somehow of us, the planet, and everything.
Yeah.
So how you see that, Catherine? Because I think that brings a completely different perspective to this element, emotion, whatever.
Thank you. It really does. My basic message is that emotion is actually a sensory system. It is. It's so big and diverse. It goes off into, behavior, and it's in our chemistry, and it's in our brains, and it's in our feelings. It's just this huge thing. And when you really boil it down to the biology underneath it, it is a sense. In fact, it's the first sense to have emerged, and that's why we feel the valence of good or bad feelings, what I call hedonic qualia, within all of our other senses, within vision and acoustic resonance and dissonance, or the pleasant and unpleasant aromas, is that basic bottom line feels of hedonic qualia. And I do argue that it's a sense that every living organism has. And in traditional academic approaches where everything's associated with the brain, there's still questions whether we're conscious, let alone other animals, and I've found it really frustrating that it's our way of justifying vivisection, the use of animals in these really horrible studies, to pretend that they don't have any consciousness. But when I'm using the word sentience very precisely as separate from the question of consciousness, because there is evidence in the brain structure, in the behavior, and most effectively and most specifically the chemistry of the neuropeptide network that integrates both the body and mind, that Candace Burt calls the molecules of emotion. So when you look at that chemistry, you start looking at the molecular level, you notice that there is cell signaling that has to do with the identity of the cell, whether it's a liver cell or a heart cell. They have to differentiate from the same DNA, and there's a developmental differentiation process that's not even really considered in evolutionary theory, this development. So when you really go all the way down, what I did in my interdisciplinary work, and I was fortunate enough to end up at Harvard, bouncing in and out, and I got to do my work basically there. I had a free run of the place. It was great. But that what I got interested in was the molecular biology beneath the circuitry that drives the behavior, the hedonic approach and avoid behavior of the bacterium. Just the idea that bacteria might have some sort of sense. But you see this approach and avoid pattern all the way down and all the way up. So I wanted to know about that, and I found out there's this beautiful chemical system. It's a little loop of mind that implies that they do indeed have a chemistry that drives their behavior, as well as provides a memory system of what was good for me and bad for me, that Pavlovian conditioning and learning can occur on. And the big thing that hit me, and why this is so pertinent to our physical and mental and spiritual health, is that at the very beginning, with the emergence of life, that's how old this sense is, that sensory motor control, moving the creature around in its environment. I talk about it like it's emotional vitalism.
And that's where you bring the emotion sentience. Am I following?
Exactly. Yes, the sentience itself is what the vitalists used to call the vital force, because it moves the organism and it guides the organism specific ways toward that which is good for me and away from that which is bad for me. But the bacterium is doing this, and that when that first started, the function of controlling behavior and adapting to the environment in the sense of our immune system were one and the same. So this little sort of mind that's generated is actually the substrate of cell signaling, all about protecting and preserving the body in each of its unique identity structures, whether it's the cellular level or the consciousness level of the organism in its environment. It's this beautiful self-regulatory sense.
I'm going to maybe ask something a little crazy.
I like crazy.
But I've seen some recent studies about emotions in plants. Have you seen it?
I've heard a
Did
little
you
bit
examine
about
it?
it. I've heard a little bit.
I didn't examine deeply, but some of the evidences are interesting, at least for us to stop and look at it. But just because we were talking about bacterium and somehow animals in general, so then I was curious to see if you had thought of that or examined at all in terms of plants, because some people, they claim that they get a feeling from plants. I know some studies long ago, but these are not recent, but that they have measured somehow the electromagnetic field
Like Clyde
of
Baxter,
plants.
that's
Exactly.
right, yeah.
And they like almost as if the plant is reacting somehow in an emotional way. That's how we are interpreting it. Of course, we are putting emotions there. We do not know if it's emotion, but there's something similar. So you have not inspected that yet, right, Katherine?
Well, I've actually, I'm very interested in all kinds of levels of intelligence, and I would argue that yes, indeed, plants, we can't observe hedonic behavior because they're rooted to the ground, so they can't run away, the way that animals can. But they have their own very unique defenses. They send signals to one another. And what I thought was really interesting is at the very root, there's a very beautiful little section of the root. It's not the meristem, but it's a functional brain in some ways. And the fact that all of these little brains are down there together, I love trees, and there's the idea of how an arbor of they're usually, it's a stand of like beech trees or something, and they're literally in a mind in and of themselves. It's a collection. So, and that's one of the things about emotional sentience that I found to be really surprising, was that it regulates the self, but that the self not only has an individual autonomous identity, it also has a social identity. And that's the one self that's mediated by our feelings. So the more complex our feelings get, the more they're entangled with the empathic expansion and connection to the other.
Of the relations.
It's really a beautiful and amazing
So
sense
somehow
that
we
we've
could
been
say
given.
that the evolution in itself implies some complexification of the emotions and everything revolving around it, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's very nice.
Well, what I mentioned briefly in my talk yesterday, and thank you so much. You gave me more time. I need as much time to really say this. It's really hard, but that it started out with this basic binary signaling of just something akin to pleasure and pain, feel good, feel bad, binary signaling, but that you can see in both the behavior of animals all the way up and in the structure of the brain, because we don't have brains until insects, but then it gets progressive. Even insects have 3 lobes, so it's really interesting. Anyway, then more and more. So now there's 3 levels of information encoded. We have feelings like trust and mistrust and shame and doubt and love and hate. Those are all the complex emotions that we feel all the time. But within those are these primary colors of basic emotions that are the same for everyone. So there's a whole meaning system here that can be unpacked. And I'm very hopeful, and I write about this with people who are interested in global peace and reconciliation processes, how emotion really does provide a common ethical value system that we can begin to start behaving like a global community and a human family. Because according to our emotions, not only are we completely connected to one another as a species, there's no disconnection, but we're connected to every life form, and every life form has the same self-regulatory priorities and rights and to exist.
And may be connected in so many different ways.
And then
those that we already know, those we don't know, but even ethically speaking, in the consequences of our actions, so in all different senses.
Well, now you're bleeding over into some of my favorite aspects of understanding emotion as a sense, because everything that I've talked about is good hard science. It's about the chemistry, it's about the brain structure, it's about observable behavior. But when you really start looking at it deep down, the little sense organs on the cell membrane that the E. coli uses is the most ancient. It's called the 7 transmembrane receptor, and it functions like the sense organ of the cell, and it dates all the way down to the emergence of multicellularity itself. And its major function is to keep biological clocks and timing, and that it responds to the ancient peptides, the molecules of emotion that I was talking about, but it also responds to simple ions and electromagnetic fields and light. So there's a deeper implication that now with quantum biology emerging, that there's something even deeper going on that is very suggestive of the idea of energy fields and souls, even, if you will, but it shows how the sense is part of the self-organizing process itself, and that the self-regulatory function is tethered directly to that. And it's very intriguing for me, having had anomalous experiences that regular science can't explain at all, that there's a possibility of this deeper sort of non-locality and information base that bubbles up as this good for me or bad for me way to even use our consciousness, especially if it has created.
Maybe to rationalize things that we don't understand.
Yes, but we have this beautiful way of, we have this creative freedom. I believe not only in free will, but that it's a participatory sort of free will that actually does help create the reality that we experience. So if we have that power, it's very wonderful that we have a sense of how to use it in ways that are going to lead us in directions that are going to be fulfilling and rewarding. And positive emotion is associated with self-development and the actualization of all of our potentials, but negative emotion, it works exactly toward that same goal by making sure that we have the stability of the body and the health of the body, so that we can have this beautiful physical experience. So it's a wonderful system.
I see that your work has implications that are very broad.
They are
Scientifically
indeed.
speaking, in terms of understanding the body, biochemistry, the brain, but also to the individual as the self personally, but to the collective, the society, and all of that. That is brilliant.
It depends how you want to define the self.
Yes.
And what I find most interesting about emotion, and why I thought it would be something that could occupy me, I'm very curious, and I like a full life, so I know it can occupy me for the rest of my life. But I really do hope to share the ideas and have people take up the study and to think about it in this new way, because there's abundant evidence. It's just though I describe my work sort of like a kaleidoscope. All the pieces are there, but when you turn it just so by using this paradigm of, there's a biological function here of self-regulation, all of those pieces fall into place in a brand new way that explains so much. There are a lot of ongoing controversies across disciplines that understanding emotion in this way can unite them. So that's sort of my soapbox.
I'm going to ask you something that I'm curious, now that you mentioned something. How do you would define or explain self for you?
Oh my!
Because it depends on what you understand by self. Yeah, that's true. But I just had in my mind so much more complex is to get a homogeneous meaning for consciousness. That is a killer, because each person has something different in mind when they say consciousness. But then when we say self, then how do you feel about it?
That's a really good question. Yes. And I hadn't really thought much about, of course, we have an idea of what we think about mind being something that, it identifies us. It goes to sleep at night, wakes up in the day. It's our history, it's our memory. Then, of course, there's our body. And then there are questions about things like spirit and soul that scientists aren't even supposed to entertain. And yet they're an essential sort of core being of who we are that I've always felt. I had some sense of who I was as a being, as an ancient being. It's even from a child, and I knew that was my ground, my foundation. So, but the fact that emotion is driven by self-relevant stimuli, it's the one thing that makes feelings different than thoughts, is that it's elicited. Well, there's four things actually, but it's the main thing, because it's stimulated by self-relevant information. As stimulus. So when you have these three levels of information, the deepest level concerns the preservation of the body. So the self is the body in terms of the negative emotions, mostly that don't do this because self-destruction will occur. But there's a whole layer, both in the basic emotions and the complex emotions, that are all about the mind and how we've learned to think about things, the knowledge that we have, all of the cultural colorings that we have. And the positive and negative emotions are literally saying, this stuff works because they feel good and they lead to certain kinds of behaviors and attitudes, this stuff doesn't work.
Yes.
Fix it. And so the self of the mind, but that also there's this much bigger concept of self that's much more abstract, because there is the self-regulation all the way up. But when you follow it down, when you realize that maybe instead of just this beautiful chemical sentience, there's the capacity to observe, which is consciousness by my definition, that's necessary. So that opens the door to deeper questions about self and self-organization with like automatic and self-making autopoiesis. And then you get all the way down to this beautiful networks of nodes where you have parts and wholes, and the self is a fractal whole of both. And when you look at the body, you actually, it's like a set of Russian nesting dolls, and you have these self-regulatory signaling that's the same all the way at every level. Everything's itself looking out into its not self environment. So you don't have to have any global understanding that you're part of this beautiful gestalt, and yet your individual behavior that's driven by this simple ethic, this positive and negative signaling, kind of keeps the whole thing together.
And keeps the mechanism running.
Exactly, but that there's this wonderful model, I mentioned it briefly in my talk, where Thies and Kauffman have this idea of the sentience going all the way down to a fundamental monistic awareness that I would call the self with a capital S, and many would call God. And that's sort of how broad the idea of self can be, because when you follow what your emotions are asking you to do, into changing this in your external environment in universal ways, changing this in your internal environment in personal ways, there's an unfolding of your own self-actualization. But that what they say is that at this deeper level, there is the self with the capital S, and the mathematics is all about symmetry breaking between the subject and the object, and so that there's an infinite possibility of self, not self boundaries within a unified non-local self. So it can be an amazing creative adventure.
Yes, absolutely, and that's what we are here for, to discuss. Hope we get somewhere closer to some clearer definition, right? More universal. That's very good. Anything else you would like to add, Katherine? That you feel you would like to say and you didn't have a chance?
Not really. Not really.
That's perfect.
I just want to thank you so much
I thank you for being here. And for those of you watching, if you are interested, you have a very thorough, interesting paper from Katherine that she is presenting us with, and will be published in the Proceedings of the Second International Congress on Consciousness on the Journal of Consciousness. So, hope to see you next time.